Well, hello everyone. Good morning on this bakingly hot day. If by any chance you're watching it on YouTube and it's raining, it really was 30 degrees at least on the day in which we had this event. And our thanks to you for joining. My name is Greg and welcome to our fourth Bath Life Business Surgery. The surgeries essentially are this: we're trying to help businesses in these unprecedented, difficult, incredibly hard to interpret times. We're trying to give practical advice and valuable insights using experts and quizzing them on your behalf so that we can get some degree of a blueprint about our own ways forwards. We can all do with help, and of course there is no monopoly on wisdom. These Bath Life Business Surgeries should help you guide you on your vital decisions in the coming weeks and months, decisions which will affect your business, your employees, and our city's economy. Our next one, and look out for this, is on July 6th with Data Sharp, and our thanks to them. We'll be communicating the detail of that shortly. Before we get going, some other news. Following a couple of sellout successes, we held another Bath Life virtual wine tasting event last week with our partner Stony Street. Once more, it raised money for the Bath Bull. You may be unsurprised to know I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bull because it is so important to Bath from a civic, from a business, but of course from a charity point of view. This year, we're not running the Bull. Instead, we're running a very special fundraising event on July 30th called Bull Aid. It's a charity, comedy, food and drink, music, quirky celebration, including some top names and even the odd bit of bull. Who knew, eh? And some raffle prizes and, of course, dressing up and all that good stuff. It's headline sponsored by Brew and Dolphin, and there are many, many others, dozens of Bath businesses getting involved because they really know that the Bath charities so need support in these times, far more so than ever previously. Please talk to us about how you can get involved in Bull Aid in the run-up to and then on the night of July 30th. There's details on the site for how you can donate, sponsor, contribute. Just imagine what you might spend at the Bull ordinarily and maybe contribute a little of that to the pot of Bull Aid, which goes to the Bath Bull trustees who distribute it to our local charities. It's the first big Bath event since lockdown. It will be a coming together, albeit virtually. And of course, it'll raise those sums for charity. Vive le Bull. Other stuff, look out for Bath Life's Our Doors Are Open campaign on social media, email, newsletters, and video. It's primarily promoting retailers, but others also coming back to commercial life. For creatives, techs, and those in the cultural sector, the deadline today is for the Creative Bath Awards. And if you're watching on YouTube, and this is subsequently, please talk to us and we'll see if we can still include you, depending on when that is. We have a special Bath Life Business Club on Monday. It's a health and beauty special. The business clubs in real life are sponsored by Mojers Druitt, the company also involved in the event today, and our thanks to them. If you have time-sensitive news, such as businesses opening up, of course, new offerings, new ideas, and so on, please talk to us about using the Bath Life weekly newsletter on Friday and every Friday. It's a very good communication channel. We have been asked about the return of Bath Life, inevitably. We will be announcing our return date soon, and we'll be making some good noise about it all, as you might imagine, about how we will come roaring back. So, to our Bath Life Business Surgery this morning with Mojers Druitt, the way ahead in the new world. We're seeking to give you practical tips. At any stage, if you wish, please ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom. They can be anonymous, if it's at all confidential or whatever, or they can be, you can name yourself and so on. I will take those questions on your behalf and put them to our two panelists. We'll be covering all forms of disputes, and particularly, of course, dispute resolution, from leases through to bills, through to contracts, but also into sorting out your business for potential exit or indeed acquisition, whether that's from a distressed point of view. Companies need some form of salvation in some cases, or from a succession planning point of view, the dynastic family type of approach, or indeed longer term sense, which lockdown has communicated to us all, that we need to think about why we do what we do, and is now the time to be thinking about potential exits. So let's come on to this. And if more generally on the business surgeries, if you have a professional interest or a service which is of relevance to others, please do contact us and we can use this as a platform to communicate. All our surgeries are of course live, but then are on our Bath Life YouTube channel. And that's primarily where people are accessing these days. Our two speakers from Mergers Through It today are both partners, and I'll be talking on your behalf and then bring in your questions as we find them. First up, we'll talk to both together, but to introduce them, Maeve England, Head of Mergers Through It's Litigations and Dispute Resolution Team. Maeve, I'll just give a quick bio for those who may not know. Partner and Head of Litigation at the and Disputes Team at Mergers Through It. She specialises in real estate, commercial property and commercial disputes, and her clients range from individuals and companies to national and global organisations. We're also joined by Tom. Good morning, Tom. He's about to come in. There we are. Tom is Head of Corporate Commercial. He's a partner at Mergers Through It, as mentioned, specialising in assisting companies with strategic acquisitions, unmuting his mic, there we are, he's on, and mergers and successful exits. And Tom has had many long-term clients where he's effectively acting as the company solicitor, as well as helping with exit planning, indeed exit execution. Let's start with some slightly more general points about business in Bath, as you've both, by the way, I should say good morning to you both. Let's say
morning, Greg.
Yeah, we're going to be civil with each other. We'll get onto the disputatious stuff in a bit. So before we come on to disputes and exits and such like, tell us a little bit about how your clients have been responding in these times. Perhaps, I know it's all going to be different in different circumstances, but how would you characterise the views of the businesses you're dealing with? Maybe some key insights. Either Maeve or Tom.
Shall I kick off? Yeah, I think it really is. It's opposite ends of the spectrum, and it seems to vary on a sort of daily basis at the moment. We've got a lot of clients who are generally optimistic, invigorated by what they've been able to do to their businesses in the last couple of months. Many are almost embarrassed about saying, do you know what, this has been a really good thing for my business because I've done made more positive changes in the last couple of months than I've done in the last few years. Right the way to the other end of the spectrum, where it's far more pessimistic outlook, and clients are genuinely worried about keeping their heads above water. So it's sector specific, it's business specific, but a lot of the businesses, and I'll speak to sort of hundreds of different businesses, and some in sectors you think would be faring a little better at the moment, maybe you're finding things a bit tougher, and vice versa. You know, businesses in certain sectors where you think that they're probably having a tougher time, and they're actually doing quite well and being fairly optimistic about life.
Well, just to press you on that, give us an example, not necessarily the company, but the sectors which are perhaps slightly more cautious or fearful than you might otherwise expect, and conversely.
Yeah, I think it's well documented, isn't it, with the high street, hospitality and leisure in particular, having a bit of a torrid time at the moment. We're in that sort of lockdown, batten down the hatches phase, and have valid concerns about how they gear up again. The other end of the spectrum, we deal with a lot of software tech businesses where relatively, I mean, everyone's been affected by this personally or business wise, but are relatively speaking unaffected, and day-to-day trading and exits and all the like are carrying on as usual.
And Maeve, do you think perhaps on balance, and I know it's very nuanced, but on balance, do you think there's more hope than fear, or are clients pretty downbeat in current times?
Well, again, it's sector specific. For example, events are going through a pretty torrid time. But what I have found is, and this might be hopeful, is that what people are concentrating on is finding a compromise with the various people that they're in contractual relationships with, so that they can find a way out of it. And so rather than smashing into the opposition and getting embroiled in a huge dispute, what they're doing is they're looking to preserve commercial relationships for after this. And so there's a little bit of sort of flexibility. I think that people are being fairly realistic as opposed to optimistic or pessimistic particularly. And I suppose that is caution, isn't it? So some people are sacrificing quite a lot to preserve relationships and to preserve an income stream afterwards.
I guess that is, we'll come on to this point about compromise, but from a commercial point of view, it is better to have something, a fair slice of a pie than absolutely no pie at all. To be, exactly. and I particularly want to explore this point about disputes over bills and contracts and so on. We'll come on to that. But if you force people too hard when they can't pay, you're going to lose everything. And I guess, but the judgment is, but you need to be pushing them because you need that cash yourself. And it's such a difficult balance for all our businesses, including our own. We face the same broad issues. Let's come on to dispute resolution. I know that's the sort of the technical term, but essentially, Maeve, your world is problem solving, isn't it? It's
yes.
bringing people together.
Yeah, I mean, it has a bad reputation because of the word dispute or the word litigation that's often used instead. But actually, what we do is problem solving, and sometimes, usually, actually, it's doing that in a commercial way and not just heading straight to court. We rarely take things to court these days, and so it's all about understanding what your client's business need is and making sure that you're listening to that. So listening, problem solving is what we do, actually.
And it's, I mean, as a corollary to that, is litigation essentially a failure that that you haven't been able to persuade everyone to seek a consensual solution?
Well, I think you've got a good point there. I mean, because these days especially, all of the information is disclosed up front very early on. So you should, if you're being objective, be able to stand back and take a look and know really more or less which way it's going to fall. So that's why 90% don't go near court. But then of course, sometimes it is trickier than that, and you have cases that go to High Court, then it gets appealed and everything gets reversed by three terribly clever people. Then it goes to the Supreme Court and even more very clever people take an entirely different view, or just more than half of them. So it isn't necessarily always straightforward. So you can't always tell right at the outset, but you're spending a lot of money if you're going to go to court. So it's got to be something that's very important.
Well, I'm going to ask a cynical question, because I know some people will be thinking this, that actually, isn't it in your interest for it to go harder, worse, bad, more expensive to court or whatever, because the lawyers win ultimately? Or is that simply...
that is cynical, and I mean, court is very expensive, but we again also were looking to preserve client relationships, and dashing off to court just doesn't make economic sense. And of the litigation lawyers that I know, they're all at heart problem solvers. It's the problem and the solving of it that they enjoy. And so you really do drive things towards resolution. And we have numerous conversations with our own clients, persuading them that that isn't going to work and this is what it's going to cost you. You know, obviously then the client takes their view, but it really isn't the case. I can hear the guffaws even though everyone is muted, but it isn't about just sort of bleeding your client to death for as many fees as you can get out of them. It just isn't. I mean, we could do that and then we'd end up gradually with no clients.
Yeah,
because they'd all go bust.
We maybe won't wrench that quote out of context, you know, but I think the point is extremely well made, and it's a sincere point. It's ultimately in your long-term interest to do what is right for the client, and that is very, very, very rarely to go to court, because it's horrific on lots of scales, including the emotional scale, the pressure it brings. But yes, the financial.
It's massive, yeah, because it will go on for a considerable length of time, and you're right. It also means you're doing that and you're not running your business.
The other way around, in these times, we sort of touched on it in the intro. Do you think people are being just a little bit more pragmatic than they might be otherwise? That they maybe it's hoped for rather than reality, but is that the case? More pragmatic?
Conversely, and it sort of is counterintuitive, this, it hasn't had an impact on the litigiousness or not of people. And probably the reason for that is litigation and disputes tend to be sort of not impacted in the same way as other areas would be, because if times are very hard, then you really do need that money. And if times are really good, then you can afford to pay for the court case. So it sort of balances out. So I haven't found that it has really particularly affected the way people approach things.
And Tom, not just on exit planning and so on, but do you think you know, on a range, are people more pragmatic because they've got to find solutions, they've got other things they need to be getting on with, or B, they are more disputatious because they're frankly more desperate?
Yeah, I think my experience so far, I've spent a lot of time talking to clients. They want to know what their fallback position is. They want to know what their rights are. There was that immediacy of the lockdown itself, and people wanting to know, do I need to continue paying under contract? Are my customers going to continue paying? Refunds, all these sorts of things which we'll talk about in due course. I think people want to know where they stand. They want that certainty in what is a world that is very uncertain at the moment. But I haven't seen many push that forward. People are being a bit more practical about it, or certainly holding their position at the moment, because I think the last thing most people and businesses need is that uncertainty of getting stuck into litigation. So yeah, probably wanting to know where they stand, but a little bit more pragmatic maybe than and a reluctance to get too stuck into things at the moment.
And from a personal point of view, for you both, obviously crossing specifically into the professional, there's an old phrase, advisors advise and principals decide. Are there times when it's actually a little bit frustrating because you think you really ought to be doing X and they're insisting on doing Y? And how do you persuade your clients to come to a more, in your view, a more measured, sensible approach, whether on exit planning or on dispute solving?
Well, I'll jump in there. I mean, I think this is maybe why we're not seeing a huge difference in approach, and I think that's because we always, from the outset with a dispute, you have a duty to speak to your client about whether or not they're going to get anywhere with it. You're not doing them any favors, and they're not going to thank you in 3 months' time when they've spent money and you say to them, oh, by the way, you're not going to win that. So you always tell them straight out where you think they're going to stand. So and I always, I think you develop a relationship with your client and they know they can trust you. They know that it's not always going to be great news that they hear, but they'll be getting the truth from you. And so I think I rely on that. And also, of course, telling them, what it might eventually cost to them if they were to dig their heels in on a particular point. So I think that we are, we're fairly robust, friendly but robust in terms of the advice that we give. And I always think there's not much point in paying for advice and not taking it.
There's also the factor as well, I think, at the moment of no one really knows where everyone stands. So you could rush off and get a judgment, or you could have the best case in the world. But what's the strength of the party you're going against at the moment? I don't think anyone really knows in this lockdown phase. It's one thing getting a judgment, it's another thing getting paid. So I think there's a little bit of wait and see going on in that respect as well.
People are generally sensible, they come in and they want to hear the facts about their case. So it's not a question of having to force them to do things.
And I guess, this applies to you each as lawyers, but also to the company, that, trust is built over some time. It's built from reputation, experience, understanding, and so on. And that is the service that you're bringing, the technical insight. Give or take, perhaps other lawyers may well have, but the trust which is built and the regard in which you're held, I guess. It's an observation rather than a question, but you may wish to comment.
Well, it is true, because I think you always start from thinking, well, how would I like to be treated? So I would always like to know what it's going to cost, and I'd want to know that early, and what my chances are. And so that's about just that word gets bandied about. It is about integrity, and it is about being honest and treating people with respect as you would want to be treated yourself. If you went off to, I went to see, for example, a doctor where I wouldn't be an expert, I'd rather be treated as an adult and told the truth, and that's the approach I think we try to bring.
The risk of being political with a small lowercase p, there was a very broad repudiation of experts a couple of years back at a certain occasion. Whereas now, if anything, the need for expertise is way higher than ever before in every single aspect of life, from health to professional advice and so on. So you too, and of course other lawyers, are right at the epicenter of the need to give excellent advice in really difficult times to businesses. So genuinely, you know, good luck with that. You've got the destiny of companies, essentially. No pressure. So I want to come on to a specific area, perhaps more for you, Maeve, which is property. Have you seen an increase in disputes over leases, particularly?
I've seen an increase in inquiries and requests for advice. At the moment, getting into a dispute with a landlord or tenant is fraught with difficulty anyway. So we've seen lots of queries about, do I have to pay my rent? And what do I do? And lots of queries from landlords about, what can I do? They're not paying the rent. So we've had particularly queries about a thing which is called frustration, which isn't a description of how everybody is feeling in lockdown. In legal terms, it's a legal doctrine, which means that the contract can be brought to an end immediately. And so that is an option in commercial contracts. And so we've had lots of inquiries about whether or not, given the fact that I can't run my business, I can't make any money, I've had to close my shop, why do I have to keep paying rent? Surely that means that this contract is frustrated and I can bring it to an end. So we've had to advise quite a lot around that.
Could you just talk through the, for those of us less familiar with the terminology, this process of frustration, is it something that, you know, one side can declare in some way, or how does it come about, and what does it actually mean in practical terms?
Well, frustration it's something that you can attempt to advance as an argument. So frustration is a legal doctrine. So the way I'm going to try and do it as straightforwardly as possible. So basically, it's a situation where something happens. Lawyers always call that a supervening event. Something happens out of the blue that nobody was expecting. Nobody's at fault. So I know everyone's already thinking pandemic. So no one's at any fault. No one caused that pandemic. And your contract doesn't deal with it. So the contract doesn't say, in the event of a pandemic, this is what's going to happen. So those three things have to be there. And the event has to be so massive and that it either makes performance of what you have to do under the contract impossible. Not interestingly more expensive, but impossible. Or it makes the contract so different that it was totally out of the contemplation of the parties, and it would be, in the court's view, unfair, unjust, unconscionable for you to have to do your bit of that contract. And so then what used to happen when this doctrine first came about was that the contract would stop, halt, and then, of course, there's the question of who's paid what. So the money then stayed where it fell. So the event happened. If you've paid, tough, money stays where it is. If you haven't, tough on the other side, because there's no obligation to do anything more. The contract is dead. But there was a law that was brought in actually during the Second World War, because as you can imagine, a lot of contracts were being frustrated in the Second World War. And so they brought in a law to deal with the money. So now basically, the rule is, just in a nutshell, that the money goes back to the person who's paid, except where the other party has carried out things that have cost them money in performing the contract. So for example, if you think of like an events company, so you've paid all your money for your wedding, and the wedding people that you've paid it to have booked a venue, they've bought equipment that they need to use, they've bought tables and chairs and things like that, they've paid for catering, it's right up to the end, so the food's been paid for. So, and then the contract, you know, sort of, a meteor falls from the sky, and but just in that venue. And so what happens then is that the person who's paid would get the money back, except for the bits that the wedding planner has already used up, as it were. That's frustration. In terms of leases, shall I go on, or am I?
Well, I just want to ask a question about that lease point. Say for example, someone has not been able to trade under the government strictures from March 23 onwards. They have not been able to use their premises. Would that be unconscionable within the context of frustration, or i.e., could the whole thing be essentially declared null and void, or at least suspended? Or is that just, you know, that's something which the two parties have to resolve and frustration doesn't apply?
Well, okay, so the headline for this is you're not going to get frustration for that. And you're not going to be able to argue it. And the reason is this, that's in all likelihood. And the reason is because although the courts have said in a case, they said in one case that it is in theory possible in terms of leases for the lease to be frustrated. In actual fact, no case ever has succeeded in that. That's the first thing. So it's an expensive experiment to undertake at this stage. But secondly, I can give you examples of even in that particular case, actually, where they decided it was theoretically possible. They decided in that case it wasn't. So if I give you an idea, that was a 10-year lease of a warehouse. There was one road into that warehouse, only one way to get in your deliveries, and it was on a street. So it was a 10-year lease. 5 years in, the local authority closed the street for 20 months. And that wasn't enough for frustration. So that gives you an idea of where we are now. And then there have been other cases. There was a case with the European Medicines Agency quite recently. It was a Brexit case because they're not allowed legally to operate in a non-EU state. And they have and so they had a very expensive premises in the middle of London. So of course they wanted to give that up and they argued frustration. But because they could, the court will look at all the circumstances. They'll look at the lease itself. So everything will fall on each contract. So they took a look at it, and actually the lease could be assigned to somebody else. So there wasn't nothing they could do. They could assign the lease, and so the court wouldn't allow it. So in our current circumstances, we've got temporary lockdown. I know it's stretching out. There is possibly the ability to assign, not that anyone's going to take on many premises at the moment, but it's highly, highly unlikely, even though theoretically a possibility, that you would be able to argue that your lease is frustrated and your obligations are over.
This is, again, very much a sort of layman's question. But, you know, one of the reasons why there perhaps isn't the case law on this is that the pandemic's only been around, it seems like ages, but it's been, you know, 100 days or 4 months or whatever. So there hasn't been a chance for precedent to be established. Is it nonetheless still possible that precedent will be established such that there could be a case in the examples we've been talking about?
Well, you'd need to have a lease where you couldn't have, where you had no other option. That's the first thing. You would need to have very, very, very deep pockets. And so it would need to be worth the fight. So it would need to be huge premises. And even then, courts are reluctant to forge new law, to extend this. And I still think it's highly, highly unlikely, but possible. Somebody who's extremely wealthy with a lot of skin in the game could have a shot at it.
Yeah, but let's no one watching us bet the house on that as a salvation route. Instead, presumably, resolution as ever is so much better. And just talk through some of the sorts of resolutions either that you've directly seen or are anticipating, whether it might be holiday periods, reduced rents, etc.
Yeah, well, actually, this is one area where people are compromising a lot because although you'd think, wouldn't you, tenants are obliged, it's not a discretionary thing to pay your rent. You have to pay your rent, and you're stuck with that, even though the government has brought in measures to prevent you from being kicked out of your premises at the moment. You would think that the tenants are really up against it, but they do have some cards to play, because any sensible landlord isn't going to dig their heels in and end up with a load of empty premises at the end of this lockdown period, whenever that is, facing into a potential recession. It's not a good idea. So they are compromising. So the things I've seen are things like, yes, rent holidays, quite serious rent holidays. And these words get bandied about. So you get rent holiday bandied about as though it means something in law, and it doesn't. It depends on the agreement each time. But what is usually meant by that is that for a period, say a quarter, 2 quarters, no rent is payable. So that's not deferred rent, that's no rent. So you get that, or you get deferral of rent. So you get, we'll pay 50% this year, but then the following year we'll pay that back over the year. So you get that sort of arrangement. The government has just produced a code very recently in June, actually, a code of practice, which is a code. It's not legislation, but it's trying to start that conversation between landlords and tenants. And it's suggesting all of these things. And plus, another idea I've seen is when you pay a smaller fixed rent and a percentage of income. So that's another possibility. And the thing that appeals about that is that both sides are taking the risk. So the landlord is taking a hit on their rent, but with the possibility that if things pick up, that they will get some of that back. So
and
that's
provided it's both parties agree and it's thoroughly documented and it's not onerous and all those usual concerns about contracts, then happy days. If it works, it works, and each is a bespoke solution.
Yeah, I'm very glad you said that about properly documented, because actually it's really important to get it in writing. And the reason for that is that a lot of my disputes are made up of those situations where nothing was written down. So all you're doing is you're funding disputes lawyers if you don't write it down. So you have to write it down, and there are certain things you should also take into account. For example, if you have deferred rent, when does interest still run? That's, does it run from the day that you didn't pay? And then the landlord gets all that, recoups all that later on. And things like, does it affect any rent review periods? Are you able to pass on the benefit if you assign it? There are all sorts of questions like that you should tie down to avoid disputes later.
As a general point about disputes, they usually entail disinterring a long argued over documents, which is then promptly forgotten as a legal contract. And that presumably is quite a frustrating process. If only X, Y, Z had been thought of, anticipated back then, you wouldn't be in the position you are now.
You can't help thinking that. So it's a mix. It's either something like that everyone ignores, or nothing in writing. You'd be surprised at how big nothing in writing is as a proportion of the work that I do.
Just as a point of law, and this is for you both really, does a contract actually have to be extant or whatever? Does it have to be in writing to have validity if there is a fully in place agreement which is operable?
No, I mean the short answer is no, it doesn't. You can have a verbal contract which can be as binding as a written contract. I think the issue here is, especially with property documentation, it's usually a deed. It's usually set out in that agreement there is a procedure for varying it, and if you don't follow that, then there's an argument that a new contract or a variation hasn't been formed. So as well as thinking about the detail, and part of that documenting process is not only the certainty of everyone knowing what the variation that's been agreed is, it's also about thinking about some of the points that Maeve just made that maybe in a sort of commercial terms haven't even been thought about it. When does interest run from? Does interest run from? And it's great. A lot of landlords are being quite creative in the way that they're structuring these arrangements, self-interested obviously to ensure they minimize their loss. But arguably, the more creative, the more requirement for certainty and getting it written down so both sides know exactly what they're signing up for.
Yeah.
In a way, the pandemic is making us all realise an absolute fundamental of business, which is it's in your interest for your partners to succeed. And if you are having to play some part in helping them succeed, then so be it, because that's in your longer term interest, I guess. Let's come on to exit planning, Tom, specifically. Is there a sense that this lockdown period has given us all sort of an existential pause where many companies are thinking, why do I do, what do I do? And in turn, it's prompting the thoughts of exit, whether forced or dynastic or longer term.
I think that's right, Greg. I think the sort of great pause, as people are calling it, I think, and one of these previous sessions that was done with some of our private client colleagues highlighted this fact. There was that initial surge when the pandemic hit and lockdown started, of people wanting to get their personal affairs in order, and people realizing their own mortality, as it were. And I think on the business side of it, there was that initial battening down the hatches, stopping, getting it paused, getting to grips with all the government schemes and furlough and all the useful things that are out there. And I've certainly noticed in the last few weeks more people are taking a bit of time and having a wider review of their business. Yeah, what's good about it, what's not, what they get out of it, and it links into that sort of personal side and planning. And as I touched on at the start, some people are genuinely optimistic and are looking forward to exploiting opportunities going forward. And I think every business will change in the new norm, but they're excited about that prospect. I think some others that I'm talking to maybe are not, and are having a sort of wider reflective moment and deciding, yeah, is this what I want to do long term? And yeah, certainly I've been having more conversations with people about succession planning. One client, yeah, is speeding that process up at family business and passing it down to their children a little bit earlier than they would expect. I'm talking to management teams about MBOs, and that being a sort of exit route for some business owners to bring the management team in and gradually migrate it across to them. So yeah, I think there's a lot of working on the business happening. I mean, I think that will shift again now as we get back to reopening and everyone's focus shifts again to how are we going to trade in the new norm, and all the kind of detailed day-to-day things, which again, the guidance on that is changing daily. How do we incorporate those and get our business up and running again? But there's certainly been that reflective moment.
And then paradoxically, isn't it, perhaps going the other way, it is now a good time, unless you have to, it's now a good time to be thinking about exiting a business, because there are so many variables. It's a bit like a rocket in the ground. It could go a tiny variable here and it goes way that way, a tiny variable there goes that way. It must be incredibly difficult to interpret value in many businesses and many sectors.
Yeah, I think as always, it's about getting buyer and seller expectations aligned, and I think in something that's as fast moving as we're currently in, and seems to change on a daily basis, that is incredibly difficult. So whilst that reflective moment might lead to a decision of actually I do want to come out, or I do want, whether gradually or look for a sale, that's one thing. Finding a buyer who's got funding and funds to do it, and agreeing a valuation on a business, which the valuation models are going to vary dramatically in the coming years to price in this current pandemic and the effect it's had on the business, and also the process generally. There's going to be a lot more focus on due diligence as to how resilient the businesses have been, and the numbers stand up this year in particular. A lot of extra debt being taken on, obviously, across the board, and how that's going to be serviced going forward. So yeah, a lot of variables, and certainly not an easy process at the best of times, but probably even more so at the moment. But that's not to say deals are not happening. They are.
Let's go on to the types of deals that are happening in a moment, if we may. I'd just like to keep it to the general point about this planning for the way ahead, as styled at the beginning of this conversation. What are the practical steps that business owners should be taking now about getting their businesses in order? Whether that's, the day-to-day, of course, but really with a view to exit at some point.
Well, I think you can never start planning it too early. I know it's a bit cliche, but you can't. So actually, even if there isn't an immediate exit, if you've had that moment and decided, you know what, I do want to wind down or come out, you can never start too early. So I think, as everyone is at the moment, number one on the list is obviously watching cash flow, forecasting that, and making sure that the business is going to stand up for the coming year. Certainly towards the back end of this year, where I think a lot are possibly going to fail. So that's just good financial hygiene management. Generally, is the sort of bare basics. I think also locking in a lot of the efficiencies that have been obtained through necessity, really, in this period. I think a lot of the people I'm talking to, a lot of the entrepreneurial clients, the ones I was talking about being quite energized by this, are quite excited by the fact it is more than ever a bit of a clean sheet of paper to redesign their business. And I think every business is going to have to shift in the way it deals with things. So I suppose it's doing that process as effectively as possible. One, to manage the short-term negative effect, but two, to protect the value that you're looking at on an exit down the line. So I think locking those in, trying to make it as resilient as possible, and just that general planning process to maximize your value at the end.
Presumably also aspects such as employment contracts and any commercial contract to be revisited with a view that if there is to be an exit, or alternatively, if current circumstances are changing the fundamentals of those contracts, whether frustration or not, now is the time to be doing it, to be working on the business rather than necessarily in the business.
Yeah, I think that's what we're spending a lot of our time doing at the moment. A lot of the issues that Maeve has talked about on my side, on the sort of non-dispute side, a lot of our time at the moment is looking at issues in terms and conditions, contracts, things that people, it's not particularly exciting stuff and people usually chuck in the bottom drawer and don't think about. Obviously a pandemic has now highlighted the weaknesses in those. So I've got a lot of clients looking at their terms of business, payment terms in particular, and trying to mitigate the risk of customers not paying down the line. Certainly taking a closer look at their insurance policies and business interruption policies and making sure that those fit in with the terms and conditions going forward. So I think again, a lot of people have been caught out, maybe just an off-the-shelf policy from a broker or whatever it might be, and have sadly have now found out that the policy doesn't cover the situation we're in. So all the talk about second wave and things like that, I think people are far more switched on to looking at those immediate trading issues, which again will then help going forward, because it's just good, it's good business hygiene and repairing a business anyway for the immediate issues it's going to face, but also maximizing value further down the track.
I want to come to one specific area which touches on multiple points that we've talked about, which is the CBIL, the government's pretty innovative loan scheme. I want to address it in a number of different ways because there's several businesses on this call who will have availed themselves of that opportunity. Firstly, can CBILs be used for acquisitions?
I'm sure any bankers on the call will say no. Yeah, they're there as a short-term cash flow, working capital facility. That said, I think there are a lot of, and again, there is a big variable here. There will be people on the call that have got a CBIL just purely to keep their heads above water and to keep their business alive. I think there are certain clients that we're talking to that are planning for the worst, but hoping for the best. And I think putting as much contingency in there as possible on the basis it is a reasonably readily accessible cheap form of funding at the moment. So if they did have a surplus at the as and when we get through the worst, they may look to use that in a more growth focused way. But I mean the banks will say they're obviously the usual sort of due diligence is done. It's potentially taxpayers' money because it's obviously government backed. So they need to be prudent in how much and what they put out. But I think there'll be certainly some businesses that will capitalise on and maybe use that extra cash in their business for growth rather than just mere survival.
I understand your reason for caution and the caveats you've given. I just wanted to press the point. So with the caveats, with sensible mutuality with banks or whatever, complete disclosure, it could be possible to use CBIL money for acquisitions or indeed for launching new product.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. There's the ones I've seen. There's certainly no restriction on it. You need to justify why you need it and what the cash flow issues are that you're experiencing linked to the pandemic. There are certain restrictions on stripping cash out of the business for obvious reasons. But no, I mean, I haven't seen anything with a specific restriction in there that would prohibit that being used for acquisition or growth generally.
Are there other ingenious, perhaps, ways of using that cash flowing for other purposes? I mean, beyond the rather grim one of redundancy payments, how else might businesses be using CBILs other than just cash flowing?
I think it's the justification for the loan has to be on a cash flow basis. So I think what we're talking about is if some contingency could be built in and things go slightly better than might have been projected in the cash flow projections. So I don't think there's any prescribed way they can use other than hopefully for some businesses, as I said, they'll have planned for the worst and things will have gone slightly better than they were hoping for, and they might have some of the other things we've been talking about, rent holidays and other renegotiations might free up a bit of cash for them, so that they do have more cash in the business at a time where maybe, yeah, I think the general thinking is the end of Q3, Q4 this year is going to be pretty bleak, pretty tough. There's some tough payment dates coming along. End of furlough. There's corporation tax due for 1st of October or 1st of Jan, depending on when company year ends are. There's a little bit of a perfect storm coming, I think, my own view at the end of this year. So if there are other businesses, some competitors may be going out of business, and if businesses have a little bit more cash on their balance sheet, they may be better placed to take advantage of that.
I mean, one of the reasons for the perfect storm is people not being willing or not being able to pay their bills. And of course, civils are in large part there to help you pay bills, which is part of the whole circularity or mutuality of business. We all rely on our debtors to pay, so that we can pay our creditors. So, but Maeve, to ask the question, have you seen already a rise in litigation over non-payment of bills?
Yeah, we've seen a rise in inquiries about litigation over non-payment of bills.
You're very cautious saying it that way, but essentially it's a looming problem. Is that fair?
It is, and it is anticipated that it's going to be massively busy. It's sort of slightly warped at the moment, the picture, because the courts are, whilst they've gone to remote hearings, those are, funnily enough, taking a very long time to work through. So there's a big backlog. So there will be, I think, a sort of a huge amount of litigation stored up for afterwards. And yeah, and people are certainly contacting us a lot about that at the moment.
Tell us what, I mean, clearly all instances are different, but as a broad approach, if you have debts which are not being paid and you're well past whatever sort of cash flow periods, well, it's way beyond terms of trade normally, how would you advise companies to just go legal early, or what?
You would find out what's happened so far. You know, so if somebody has been ignoring, you possibly go earlier than you otherwise would. The first question you'll be asking them is, are the other side good for the money? Because there's no point, as Tom said, in getting a judgment. There's a difference between getting a judgment and getting your money. There's no point in going to court and spending an awful lot and risking it yourself to get nothing. So we always start by advising on potential cost, because that's part of a business person's decision on whether or not they're going to go down that road. And then you would, generally speaking, make contact. People will very often react more to a solicitor's letter than to a letter from the others, just from their counterpart. But there comes a time where, if there is no other remedy, then that is what you will do.
I mean, one thing to just jump in there, and I believe it, the bill is getting royal assent tomorrow, is the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill. Is about to come into play, and that's another thing for businesses to factor in. There's various changes to the insolvency procedure. So the government have done their support package with the money and the schemes that they've put in play to try and keep businesses afloat and to stop job losses. The next phase of that.
Tom, if I could ask you perhaps briefly, if it is possible, to just précis the key changes of that, or if that's too naive a question, I'm assuming you'll be putting out some sort of...
Yeah, not at all, Greg. No, the key things are, headline points are, potentially it's going to give businesses in difficulty a moratorium period, 20 days, if they are really in difficulty. And this links to Maeve's point about enforcement in that moratorium, and that can be extended to 40 days. You can't enforce against the business. There's also temporary suspension of things like wrongful trading for directors. Could become personally liable under the old regime if you carry on trading a business and it hasn't got a chance of turning the corner. You could get personal liability. That's being suspended as well. And the other key one, again linking to enforcing contracts, is a lot of contracts will contain a standard insolvency type clause that says if the customer, the supplier, goes into an insolvency process, then the contract naturally terminates. What the changes in the insolvency corporate insolvency bill are trying to do is go for more the model in the United States, which is to try and keep it viable for longer. So they're stopping people relying on those clauses and immediately terminating the contract to try and keep the flow of supply. There's protections in there for suppliers and smaller companies in particular that would endure hardship as a result of having to keep supplying an insolvent business. But it's the general theme of the new provisions is to keep things alive a little bit longer to try and find a solution for it. So from an enforcement point of view, if you have got companies that owe you money, that's another risk to build in, is that if they do go into this moratorium, you could be stuck as a creditor for 40 days plus.
And how does that, and again, forgive me if this is too naive a question, how does that moratorium and desire to keep an opportunity alive longer connect with the CVA structure, or is that just not the same thing?
It's similar, but not under the old provisions. The minute you go into an insolvency procedure, the directors lose control. Insolvency practitioner will come in and take control of the business effectively. And the big problem they have from a viability point of view, or keeping that business alive, is the fact that supply is automatically shut off. So there's some general provision there now already to, essential services have to keep, to a certain extent, have to keep providing. But this is wider. This is going down a more US model, where it gives that period, just gives the business a little bit longer to try and find a way out of it, and maintains the supply flow into it. So it's designed to keep things afloat.
Well, I said earlier something along the lines, we've never needed experts more, but the idea of major legislation which affects pretty much every single business at the height of a pandemic, at the point at which we are most uncertain, that's when we need expert advice. So we look forward to the briefing paper. I'm sure you'll be putting out in short due course on that. I want to come back to exits and distressed purchases, perhaps. Are you experiencing, Tom, a rise in people who see, they've taken all the mitigations, they've looked at all different loans and grants and whatever, they've hacked their business as horribly and as toughly as it is to do that, but they still can see no way forward, so they're looking to exit as effectively a distressed asset?
Yeah, I think we're all aware of the kind of high street failures, and every day there seems to be more and more press about different businesses in different sectors failing. On a more local level, we're having conversations, and people are, I'm sounding like an accountant now and probably just stepping on toes, but it's all about cash flow maintenance at the moment. And I think there are a lot of businesses that I think have been kept afloat by the furlough, and hopefully will be kept afloat by Sybil. But I think they know towards the back end of this year they are going to hit a point where they can't. So I think whether they're able to do something prior to that to improve their cash flow, or find a route to exit, or whether it's going to be a distressed exit later in the year, I think there are quite a few businesses who are faced with that sort of dilemma at the moment.
And although it's almost in the term a distressed sale, sounds like a terrible thing for the business owner, and largely it is. But it is also a route of salvation, and it relies on active buyers. And it really, as ever, it takes two to tango on such deals. Are you seeing potential acquirers make contact to say, we're in the market for X, Y, Z? Is that part of your role? Yeah,
I think that certainly is more and more. We get bombarded with various contacts, but there are funds being set up. There's a lot of private equity money around at the moment that needs to be put out, BCTs and the like. There are funds.
So what are BCTs?
Oh yeah, just the sort of some equity money that has a time frame on it, basically, that has to be used within a time frame, and that fund is coming up to those timelines, 12-18 months. So that money needs to get out into the market and be used. There are funds specifically being set up for it. There are also just general bank funding. You're talking to various banks, as I do. You'd assume that 100% of their time at the moment is consumed with doing Sybils. Some time is, but actually a lot of their time they are looking at funding other projects, and some of that might be bolting on a business or an acquisition of some sort, and that's happening. So that's encouraging to see. I mean, that's all going to be linked, and it's all going to come back to the confidence in the market generally, and how sharp and fast the recession is as to whether that funding stays there. But at the moment, there's definitely people there for it.
And just to that point, do you think there is are you experiencing that appetite for risk? Because any acquisition in current times is probably more risky than at other times, and that then is reflected in the price. Or are potential acquirers being more cautious and saying, to your view about the end of the year is going to be a much tougher time, I'm going to hold because I think there's going to be a better chance later on, or simply I just don't know?
Bit of both. I think there's a realism in a lot. Back to what I said before about aligning buyer and seller expectations. We have a transaction on at the moment that it went on hold, and pre-COVID it was going to be virtually cash up front on completion. That deal has now looks like it's coming back on stream, and the price has remained the same, but the structure of it has completely changed. And actually, the vast majority of it now is deferred. So it's what we would call vendor financed, in the sense that it's deferred payments, and there's contingent payments in there as well in earn out. Seller is saying he wants out. They want to sell. There are reasons to sell, and he's prepared to share some risk with the buyer and saying, well, I'll take a proportion of the value in it. I'll get in with you and share that risk, because I think it's a strong business that will continue to trade well. So part of the consideration is now linked to earn out and how well the business does going forward. So there's still an upside. Yes, it's an increased risk environment, but I think where people are being sensible about sharing that risk, there's still deals to be done.
Do you think some buyers are, being actively opportunistic, perhaps even predatory in current times?
Yeah, I think that's any time. I think you will get that. I think in a turbulent period like we're going through at the moment, absolutely. I know certain clients of mine that have been approached, and we've done a little bit of digging in the background, and perhaps the purchasers are not the ones you choose to proceed with. So yeah, I think there's a bit of being opportunistic. There's also a bit of, as you said, let's wait and see, and we might get this at a distressed valuation later in the year, rather than a higher valuation now and get a distressed valuation on it later, when the business probably has taken a turn for the worse.
We've covered a lot of ground this morning. I wondered if, on reflection, when you think of some of the areas we've touched on, either if the points of amplification or areas we haven't brought up. So, any tips for businesses listening to this about how you can help them navigate these times?
For me, I think it's don't waste the lockdown period, the pause. I think people have spent some time thinking about their business. It links into that sort of planning generally, but it's worth using the tech if you are, and as most businesses are going to have to change and reinvent themselves slightly in the way that they provide their goods and services and whatever they do, is, I suppose get your house in order, which is a big task at the moment, because there are just day-to-day practicalities of running a business which consume all of our time. But looking at terms and conditions, looking at contracts, looking at leases, all these the variations that we've been talking about, getting the certainty on those, cash flow management, absolutely number one priority for everyone, and make sure that it's not just looking at the next couple of months, it's further down the track where there's going to be a tough period coming. And all of that is just general good hygiene for a business, and from my side of things, puts you in a far better place down the line if you are looking to exit and maintaining value.
And just on that cash flow point, I personally would just like to reiterate one point we touched on, which is now is the time for you to be paying your bills, because if you're not paying your bills, how are you likely to have your own bills paid? And there is that circularity and interrelatedness, particularly in the city of Bath, where so many businesses are trading with each other. Now is not the time to hold on if you have the ability to pay. Maeve, what's your take?
I echo what Tom has said, and so I've had clients talking to me about how they've suffered so much pain in this. They're determined to get something good out of it too. So they are looking at sort of bigger pictures. Like I've got a client who's giving up. They're lucky. Their lease is coming to an end in the middle of London. They were going to renew. They're not now. So that's a massive saving. So there, and obviously the change in working practices is something that it would be a shame if we gave that up, because it's cost savings. But my main take is this: I would say this isn't the time to put your head in the sand. There are really horrible problems facing many businesses, most businesses, and it never is going to get better by ignoring it. So the people I see who are managing to do okay are talking. So if they have a problem, they talk. If they can't pay their rent, they talk, and they keep having conversations and relationships and find a way through rather than ignoring it and then finding yourself with a much bigger problem. So it's time for talk really.
Talk, which we've been doing this morning, and also, as you're saying, just do not be in denial. Very, very, very rarely, if ever, problems solve themselves. If there's a problem coming, we all need to be dealing with it as appropriately as we can and as fairly as we can. I'd like to thank Motorist Druitt today, specifically to Maeve and to Tom for this session. Thank you. Thank you for all of those in attendance today and watching it subsequently on YouTube. Please look out for the next Bath Life Business Surgery with Data Sharp on July 6th. There'll be another, on a convivial basis, there'll be another Bath Life virtual wine tasting event with Stony Street, raising money for the Bath Bull. I will bang that drum for the Bull one more time. Please, please join in Bull Aid on July 30th. The charities of Bath absolutely need you right now, more so than ever before previously. Look out for our Bath Life Business Club on Monday. It's a health and beauty special. Business surgeries, if your company has a professional advice or in key areas such as we've heard today for any business, now is the time. Please step forward. We can provide the platform. All of us need help. All of us are trying to navigate our way through these very strange times. These are testing times for all businesses. Whether you've been trading throughout or returning blinkingly in recent weeks, it'll be the autumn, which Tom touched on particularly, will be our proving ground. And now is the time to do all that we can to prepare ourselves for that. I hope you found this a useful session. Good luck and good wisdom to us all. This has been a Media Clash production, and this has been our third Bath Life Business Surgery. Thank you. Bath together.